Hello, welcome to the shed. In today's video I'm going to be talking about the four main finishes that I use and then how to apply them. And then at the end we're going to be applying one of the finishes to the box that I made in last week's video so I can show you how to apply it properly. Hope you enjoy. So the finishes that you see here in front of me today, three of them are the main ones that I use for woodworking as long as it's not exterior, and then this one here is the main finish that I use for exterior uses. So I'm not really going to show you how to apply this particular one today, but I'm going to talk about it just so you know what I use for exterior applications. So let me clear some of this out of the way, and we'll start with one of the very basic, and that is linseed oil. The linseed oil that I use is actually raw linseed oil. The main reason I use raw linseed oil is if you're going to go with boiled linseed oil, all of the commercially available boiled linseed oils have chemical dryers in them, and I don't like getting that on my fingers, and I don't like using that in my woodworking because I want to try and keep my finishes as natural as possible. Whether that is oils or anything else, that's why I tend to avoid things like polyurethanes. Linseed oil is a polymerizing oil, which means that as it dries, it kind of bonds to the surface and it kind of makes its own film on the surface. I use things like my raw linseed oil on chopping boards, wooden spoons, anything like that, because it's a completely natural product. It's food safe. Now, a lot of people would say use mineral oil, and I don't touch mineral oil because mineral oil is a petroleum derivative, therefore not actually a natural product. I've got a piece of pine here. I'm just going to show you how I apply the linseed oil, which is obviously very straightforward. Just a bit of paper towel or a rag, or you can brush it on. So you get a little bit on there, and as you probably are aware, wipe it onto the surface. Now I like to do little circles like this, work it into the grain, and then I like to let it sit, so you can see how it's sort of floating on the surface here. I like to let that sit for a little bit and let it absorb it. Now, if that absorbs and it still looks a little bit dry in a few spots and it's sort of uneven, you know what I mean, it kind of comes out a little bit splotchy sometimes. I apply more oil to those areas. And I just want to show you what happens when we apply it to end grain as well. So if we apply this to end grain, and this is the only finish that really has a problem on end grain, it can soak in extremely fast on the end grain, so it may require more coats on the end grain faster than it will here. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but it's still a little bit wet here, but this is dried all over in the rest of the spots, so I like to go ahead and just apply a second load of oil like that. So that first coat is sort of flooding the surface to a degree. You don't want too much oil to be soaked in because it's going to take a long time to dry, especially if you're using raw linseed oil. But here in Australia, it's pretty warm most of the time, and I don't have any problems with it taking a long time to dry. You might in other parts of the world, but here I don't have a problem. But if you want to use boiled linseed oil, go right ahead. On this occasion, we can see that it hasn't actually made that end grain blotchy, but it does soak it up quite fast, and we can see quite a difference between how much is soaked into the end grain here. So you can see the color difference here versus the color tone here. So it's a lot darker because the oil has been soaked in further on that end grain, as you can see there, and it's darkened it a lot more. So that's something you've got to bear in mind when you're putting these finishes on, that there might be a little bit of a color change depending on the end grain or just the straight face grain. So that is now dry to the touch. There's a little bit of an oily residue left, but it is dry to the touch, and on the end grain here it's not dry because it's soaked in more. That's actually staying a lot wetter here, so you may require more time for your end grain to dry. One caveat: linseed oil, or any polymerizing oil for that matter, if it's on a rag like this, it can spontaneously combust, and that means that if it's scrunched up like this, thrown in a bin, and it's scrunched up and it has a lack of oxygen around it, and it's really the lack of oxygen while it's scrunched up that causes the problem, it can generate heat and it can combust. So be very careful with these rags. If you've got space, keep them out flat let them dry, and then you can bin them once they're dried. You'll feel that it's polymerized and it gets all brittle. But once that's dry, you can go ahead and dump it in the bin. It won't combust after that. But you have to be really careful with these. The other thing you could do is put it into a metal trash can or into a pot or a jar of water. And if you fully submerge it in water, it's not going to combust. And you could just throw it out in a container with water. If it's an old plastic container or something with a screw lid, you could tape that up after you've filled it up with your rags where your water is, and just throw that in the bin, and that won't cause a problem either. But for me, I'm just hanging it over my lamp that is just straight here, my light lamp, and that'll dry up there because I don't really want it on the ground. I don't have a lot of space in here. But that's just something to bear in mind. Need to let those rags dry and not just scrunch them up and put them in the bin. So now I'm going to move on to my second finish, and that's good old paste wax. Now, this is a homemade paste wax. If you haven't seen the video on that, I will leave that link down below. It's very, very easy to make. So if you are interested, just check that video out. Now, this particular paste wax is just raw linseed oil and beeswax. And if you want to check those ratios out, once again, check that video. Now, this finish goes hand in hand along with the oil, and it is just as quick and easy to use, in all honesty. And quite often, the paste wax is used in conjunction with a lot of these other finishes. You can put it on by itself, which I'll show you in a minute. You can put it in over the top of other finishes, such as your linseed oil or any of your oils you put on. You can use it on the top of any film finish as well, including things like shellac, and quite commonly with shellac it's used to help level out the finish. I believe you can put it on top of other things like wipe-on polys, varnishes or anything like that. As long as those finishes are dry, you can go ahead and put a paste wax over the top of that, and that'll help to make it feel nice and smooth and slippery and soft to the touch. It particularly makes it feel soft to the touch when you've got something like an oil finish that's dried on your timber. Because there's no film in there, it actually makes the fibers feel nice and soft to the touch. So once again, paper towel or a rag, anything like that. So I'm going to scoop some paste wax out just like this. Now, you don't want too much paste wax. If you get too much on the surface, you're going to wipe the excess off as it sort of dries anyway. So don't go too crazy, but you do want to get ample amount on there. So this is where I put my linseed oil, and this is where I'm going to put my paste wax, right here. We can come in and we're going to do those circles once again. So as you can see, I'm already applying it almost identical to the linseed oil. So you can wipe it on. It'll soak into the surface a little bit. Now, if you can compare right side by side, these are almost identical in the look of the finish. The only thing is, I do notice when you put just straight paste wax on, it doesn't soak into the grain quite as much as the oil does. So you can see it's slightly darker in these growth rings here than it actually is going to be here. The process here is you put it on, let it sit, it'll soak in a little bit. It's not going to soak in a whole lot, but once it's dry to the touch, now if you've got too much on there, it's never going to feel dry to the touch, but in a pinch, you can just wipe any excess off. So let's do that now. We're going to wipe that excess off. And you can just let it sit there. Once it feels dry to the touch, come back in with either your paper towel, microfiber cloth, or a horse or a natural haired brush like this one is. This is just a Kiwi shoe polishing brush, natural horsehair. And you can actually use that and polish the surface over like this, and it'll help to, thin everything out and finish the surface. Or you can just come in and rub it like this, polish it out. So now that we've got those two done, you can definitely see that the linseed oil here is much darker, especially on these growth rings, than it is here. That is one thing to bear in mind. So if we combine the two of them, I know you're not going to be able to see it, so you're just going to have to trust me here, but this feels a lot softer and smoother to the touch because of the wax in here versus just the linseed oil. The linseed oil still feels smoother than just the straight grain over here, which feels a little bit rough, but there's a softer feeling to it. Obviously, the beauty of this finish is it's a very basic finish, and it does dry extremely fast. It's much faster drying than the linseed oil, and as I understand, with the wax added to that linseed oil, you don't have to worry about these cloths combusting. Don't take my word for that, but I've never had a problem with a paste wax cloth combusting. But if you're worried about it, once again, you can hang it up to dry like you do with the straight linseed oil. But with the wax added, the oxygen can't really get into the oil, so it's not such of a risk of any combustion occurring there. Now, if you want to use other paste waxes, you can go ahead and use any bought paste wax. They're going to have all sorts of combinations of waxes and various oils and stuff in them, so just use your manufacturer's instructions. But paste waxes, you're going to apply the way I have here with pretty much all of them. There's not really any difference in paste waxes, even if they are a slightly different combination. So now we're moving on to shellac. Now, this is a finish that you've probably seen me use the most. I really love shellac. It does create a little bit of a film finish, so it's a little more protective than the likes of paste wax and oil. With the premixes here, there's different cuts of the mixes. This is a 2 pound cut, this is 1 pound cut, and if you want more information on how to mix your cuts and stuff with shellac, I have done a video, so I will leave that link down below, and it's got a nice table in there that shows you all the small mixings if you just want to mix up a small amount as you go, which is the recommended way to do it. For today, I'm going to show you how to apply this to the box. There's a few different ways that we can go about doing that. But before I do that, I just want to touch on the fourth finish that I have here, and then we'll just jump back to the shellac. This is Montcel Gold Marine Grade, and it is a boat grade glossy clear varnish, and I use that if I've got some external signs. I've used that on my flooring down here. Your patrons out there, they'll actually know what I'm talking about, so if you're interested in that, maybe consider joining Patreon. I find that it's pretty much the only thing that stands up well in the harsh Australian sun and the UV. It still breaks down much quicker than you would expect. However, for exterior applications, it does work fairly well. Enough on the varnish. Let's jump back to the box, and I'll show you how to apply the shellac. For applying the shellac, I'm going to be using this 2 pound cut. So that's 2 pounds of shellac flakes diluted in a gallon of alcohol. In applying that finish, there's a few ways you can do it. You can create what's called a rubber to apply it, and that's the natural way that a French polish was done. It's usually some sort of cotton cloth with some kind of wadding in behind. You fill that wadding up, and then you run that across the surface. So if I'm not applying with that, how do I apply it? Now, if you've seen my videos on the way I apply it, you know that I apply it using a brush. Now, this brush is natural goat's hair. You want to use a natural brush when applying shellac, because any of the artificial fibers tend to leave a lot more streak marks than just the natural Hague brush like this. The other thing you want to have on hand when you're using shellac is some sort of alcohol to clean that brush. So to apply this, I've just got a scrap lid here, and you want to pour a little bit out. You don't want to use too much at a time, because you don't want to overdo it, obviously. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply it to the main body first and give you an idea of how I go about doing this. What I like to do is come in, and on the long grain I put it in the middle of my grain here. So any additional supply of your shellac is sitting in the middle, and it's not going to run on the sides. And then you run across the long grain like this, end grain to end grain. And then after I've done something like this, where I know I haven't got too much on my brush, that's when I'm bringing it back, and I'm going to apply it along the edge of my end grain on both sides, like so. Now, if you have a close look at that now, you can see that there's no running, so that's a really good way to apply it to prevent running of your shellac. then if I'm doing something like this, again, I'll just touch my brush there, or you can actually tap your brush off like that just so you don't have a lot on it. And you can actually run the end grain like this, and you'll see that has run a little bit. So if there's any running marks, just get your brush on it and just wipe lightly across it just to collect it so it doesn't pull up, because that's going to leave a big lump that you don't want in your finish. And then you're actually trying to do full strokes, end grain to end grain, end grain to end grain. Now when you're putting this first coat on, that doesn't matter a lot. So let me go ahead and get this finish on, and you'll see how quickly it is to apply at least this first coat. Now, the end grain is sometimes a little bit thirsty, so if you need to come back while you're applying it to the rest of it, you can actually just add another coat in on the end grain of your board, just so it's kind of at the same level as the rest. And then we can go ahead and redo the bottom. Again, we started in the middle here, ran it through, and we don't need to touch the end grain here because we've already done it there. So after you've applied that first coat, it dries extremely fast, and it'll only be a few minutes. And what you're looking for is you just tap it like this, and if it feels slightly sticky to the touch, you know it's not dry yet. So when it comes to the second coat, because of the nature of shellac being shellac flakes or shellac powder diluted in alcohol, we don't need to actually sand the surface between coats. So what happens is, because we have alcohol on that brush in subsequent coats, that alcohol breaks down the surface below and actually melds the two surfaces together, or the two layers. So there's no need to rough the surface for it to stick, because it's going to do that by itself. You've got to work fairly quick with subsequent coats, because, and you want to also try and get a coat across in as few strokes as possible, because it's breaking it down. Your bristles, if you're using a brush to apply it, can actually leave streaks in it, and it'll go deep into the surface. So you want to get second, third, fourth coats on as quick as possible. Now if you're applying it with a rubber, that doesn't really apply, but because you're doing very, very thin coats and you've got a nice smooth pad, it doesn't tend to break it down. But with bristles, which I'm sure is what the majority of you are going to be using if you're doing a finish on a box like this, you just got to be quick. While I've been talking, this side that I first started on here is already dry. Others are still a little tacky, so let's start here with the second coat. You want to obviously load your brush up, but you don't want too much, so let it drip like that. You don't want really any excess in the brush. Now you're going to start in the middle, come back and go right across, and then after you've got it going like this, one the stroke, one the stroke, one the stroke. Turn your brush because you've still got finish on the other side, and try to avoid having to come back to touch them up. But if you do miss some areas, you can come back, but you just want to be quick about it, because every other time you come back and retouch the surface like I am here, it can leave subsequent streaks from your bristles in that finish. One of the best ways that I like to do it when you're putting a second coat is, and that's if you're doing it on a flat piece, is to come in and do your first coats on your end grain like so. Get your end grain done first, and then you're going from wet to wet, wet to wet, wet to wet. So you're actually leaving a much more complete finish on the surface when you apply it like that. And because you're running from a wet surface to a wet surface, it just applies in a flatter coating and gives a better coverage. So just so you get a good idea, let's finish off the rest of this box. End grain, end grain, end grain. And as you're noticing here, I'm flipping that brush a lot just so I'm still getting full finish, because both sides of the brush contain finish. And if you haven't got enough on your brush, make sure you do grab some more finish, because you want to make sure you're applying a nice even coat of finish. But as I said before, you don't want to overload your brush either. I'm going to set that off to a side. While we do that, I still want to put a finish on this lid so you can see that. So when it comes to the lid on a box like this, and you know how we left tolerances if you saw the video when we built the box, and I'll leave that link down below for you as well. That tolerance is also to allow us to put a bit of a finish on the inside of the lid. Now, I like to put a finish on the inside of the lid, and not necessarily the inside of the box. It depends what you're using the box for as to whether you want to put a finish on the inside of the box. And you can certainly do that, but it's harder to sort of level that finish out afterwards. If it was a box with a hinged lid, you'd probably just go ahead and just finish just the outside of the lid. But you want to do that separate from the box in this case. As this is the lid, we want to be a little more careful with this finish. We definitely want to make sure it's not going to run. So you can actually just come the opposite way here and make sure you're wiping both edges of that each time, no running. And we're just going to hand hold it like this. And because we have these stops, we have a natural place to put this down to let it dry. Because at the end of the day, the spot that you really want your finish to be is the outside of your lid. And for that very reason, I'm only putting one coat under the underneath of this lid, because when you put finish just on one side, particularly something flat like this, it can cause it to cup, because moisture gets in on one side and not on the other. But on the box, that's not such an issue, because it's actually held together, so it's being restricted from movement. And something flat like this, even though we do have these stops on here, they're not really going to stop it from cupping. So you just want to make sure you seal that other side, just to help that moisture not get in there. Now, you might want to wear gloves when you're using this stuff. This stuff is extremely sticky, and you might want to be careful with it with gloves. I'm pretty careful when I do it, but it does clean off your fingers really easy with a bit of alcohol, so that's up to you. So our box is still a little tacky to the touch, so I'm going to get back to you once it's dry, and I'll show you the next step. So if you're waiting for a coat to dry and you don't really want to rinse your brush out because you're going to be reusing it, there's a few things you can do. You can leave it submerged in your pot of shellac if you want to. You could have a pot of alcohol left next to it if you really wanted to and leave it in there, but then that's essentially cleaning it. Or you can get a bit of paper towel like this, get some alcohol on it, so you got a nice wet spot that's enough to cover your bristles, and you can come in like this, wrap that paper towel over it, and then get a plastic bag or some Glad wrap or plastic film wrap, wrap that around it, and that's going to keep that brush like that. It's going to keep it from drying out, so it'll keep that shellac from hardening. Otherwise, you're going to have to soak it in the alcohol to get your brush useful again, which you don't really want to be doing between coats. You want to just go in and just use it straight away. So that's one solution for that. So it's now dry. The lid is almost dry as well. I'll just start on the main body so you can see this process. Now, for this, what I use is 4/0 steel wool. So I just pull a piece off, wad it up like this. Now, what we want to do, now that this is dried, is this shellac is rough to the surface. It's a little bit rough in the hand. So we're going to be smoothing and evening out that surface. You can use the steel wool straight on the surface just to knock back your shellac if you want to. And that leaves a powder everywhere that you got to clean up. Now, another way that I've seen it is that because we want to make this nice and soft to the surface, we can use steel wool in combination with the paste wax. And that is the way that I like to do it. You've probably seen a number of videos where I've done that with the totes and handles on hand planes and other various tools. And the reason I like to do that is it gives a very good finish and a very good result. So I just wanted to show you where there's a little bit of unevenness. I don't know if you can see that on the camera here, but the two levels here are a little bit out, and it's left a slightly thicker amount here. And the steel wool will level that out. So just like when I showed you how to apply the paste wax, in this case, you can get a very liberal amount on there. And what you want to do is go with the grain. So you can kind of hear that it's making kind of a sawing sound of sorts when you go over the surface. So you go ahead and we apply it with that liberal amount, like that. And if you look really close here, you can see little bits in the metal here. When we come and wipe that back later on, we will remove that. And that's the only downside of using 4/0 steel wool. This is the Sifter brand. I know there are more expensive brands out there, and I don't know if they fall apart quite as easily as this one. I haven't used them, so if any of you have used some of these more expensive steel wool brands, let me know down below if you have the same issue with it leaving little bits of metal like that around. Although it doesn't stay in the final product, it'd be nice if it didn't do it. And if you used Scotch-Brite pads, you won't get that. Then obviously we want to get in on the end grain. So I go the opposite way with the end grain, and then now I tend to go back and forwards twice like that, but it's always with the grain. And I'm putting a firm amount of pressure, but not a heap of pressure. So let's go ahead. We'll finish off the rest of this box. It's only going to take a couple of minutes. Let's get this top end done. And you just want to turn that steel wool over if you don't want to replace it. I don't have much left to do here, so I want to try to avoid replacing it, even though it is falling apart a bit. Probably don't really need to apply finish to the bottom, but I like to apply it all around, so why not? This is your box, your project, so you get to decide. And then obviously this top edge here, now we need to let that sit on here and let it dry a little bit, just like I said before when we apply paste wax. We're still applying paste wax, it's no different this way. So we want to let this dry a little bit. But prior to letting it dry, I've found that with the bits of metal filings on there from it, after you've got it all complete, you want to come in, leave it maybe 5 minutes or so, and then come back in and you want to wipe that excess off. Give it a good wipe back like this. What that's doing is one of a few things. It's removing any excess paste wax that you don't want sitting on the surface. It's going to then allow that to dry faster, and it is removing any little bits of metal that might have been left by your steel wool, which is unfortunate, but you want to get that off before it really stains the timber or gets stuck in your shellac finish. It's going to be less of a problem if your shellac is nice and hard, but if you've not left it, say 8-6 hours to fully harden, even though it's dry to the touch, it might still be a little soft, which is obviously what I've got here, but I'm trying to speed this process up for you. So now we want to leave that about 10 minutes, 5 minutes in a pinch. So what I'm going to do is we'll leave that sit to dry, so we come back and I'll show you the final process. And we're going to put a little bit of paste wax while we wait on the lid. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next step. Obviously, you can leave it a little bit longer if you want to get a better result. However, the quickened result still works fairly well, so if you are in a rush, you can just leave it a few minutes and then go ahead and work on that paste wax one last time. I tend to use my horsehair brush that I was talking about earlier for this process. Now you go in circles like this and you're burnishing that paste wax. And it's leaving it nice and smooth without that sort of oily finish. It's just like a nice smooth waxed coat. if we're going to do that with the brush, or you can actually wipe it with the cloth and then come in with the brush like this afterwards. And it's something about the process of pushing these bristles over the top polishes it out even further and gives a light sort of luster to it, which is why I prefer using this over just the cloth. You want to get a bit of a workout in there, because the more you do, the better that surface is going to come up. And then leave it another half hour for that paste wax to fully harden, and you should be good to go. Now, if you have a close look at this, you can see that there's a bit of a luster to the surface, and sort of as the light hits it, it kind of changes and refracts the light off and makes the box look kind of neat, to be honest. I like the way the finish looks. You can still see the final result here has resulted in quite a nice box, and the change to the luster and the grain popping, particularly on the end grain, is more noticeable, just like it was with the oil here, but not quite as noticeable. It's not quite as dark, but it's getting close to it. So the main reason the big three that I use is oil, paste wax and shellac is that you can use them by themselves, or you can use them interchangeably together. The only one of these finishes that you can't put something over the top of is the paste wax, because that is always going to be your top layer if you're using more than one of these together. And in actual fact, you can, and I have seen a few other YouTubers do this test, you can oil your board, let your oil dry, you can then shellac over the top of that oil. If you're looking for a particular pop of the grain from the oil that you're not getting from your shellac, which you usually do get from the shellac, but if you're not, or you're not happy, you can obviously do that. You can then put shellac over the top of the oil. Once your shellac's dry, and you can put your paste wax over the top of that, and that just gives a really good sort of triple whammy finish if you really wanted to. In most cases, I don't see the need to. You're either going to oil it and paste wax it, or shellac and paste wax it in my mind. So there you have it, folks. As you can see, it's fairly simple to apply the finishes that I use. I like natural finishes, obviously, except for the exterior grade varnish. I like to have my finishes as natural as possible, so if they do get on my hands, I don't have to worry about it and all that sort of thing. We also saw the finishing up of the box that was built just previously in the last video, and if I do say so myself, it came up looking pretty good. I do like the look of that just light colour to the pine, or if you do have some of the other coloured shellacs, like an amber shellac, I believe this box would look really great in that as well. So now you know how to finish your own box, if you followed along and made your own. If you like this video and you'd like to see some more videos like this, please consider checking out the video up here where I built this pine box, if you haven't already seen it, in the beginner series, and I'll also leave the link to the full beginner series up here as well. Bye for now.